Hi everybody, Rob here from Prior Studios, and welcome to this, what I think is quite an exciting tutorial, which is going to be how to get started with Cycles4D, which is a new render engine based on Cycles, which is a Blender render engine. Now, it's a particularly beautiful results, and it's a very powerful workflow, but also probably something of a break from tradition for you Cinema 4D artists, as it's a node-based system. But before we kind of jump into the nodes, let's have a quick look at how to set up our scene. So first things first, let's go to our render settings and make sure that we're in Cycles. So use the drop down just for Cycles4D, which we'll have here. And in the Cycles4D section, we have a few settings. Now we'll look at these in greater detail further down the line because there's a lot to look at, but the defaults are pretty good. The main one for you to worry about is the device you're going to use to actually make your renders. So I've got this set to CUDA, so I'm using my Quadro K5000, and everything else I'm going to leave pretty much at default, and we'll talk about those later on. So we can close that down. Now, one of the joys of using Cycles4D is the live preview. So if we come to the Cycles menu here and choose real-time preview, this will open up a new window which will voxelize the scene and kind of create the mesh and set everything up into memory. And we can also have a similar option here, so we can choose the device. I'm going to go for my Quadro again, and I'll give this, say, 20 samples. Now, if you ever see a material which has this kind of magenta look to it, the reason for that is that it's missing a texture path. And what we can do here is I have this in a separate layer, so I have environments switched on. So let's turn these on. If I choose my environment, which is this one here, I think, let's open up the node window. Okay, so it's not that one. It must be none of those. Okay, so it's this one here. So you can see floor grid 04 TIFF. I'm going to find that again, so I'm just going to click load image. I'll just locate that, and yes, that's fine. I do want to copy that across, and now we'll close that down. Now I didn't go through that very clearly in a node way, just because we'll move on to starting from scratch. I just wanted to show that if you ever have anything magenta, it's because there's a missing texture link. Okay, so now you can see that, and we have our ball here with our floor grid and just default materials on the ball and the ring at the bottom. So I'm going to go back to my layers and I'm going to hide those environmental parts because I don't need to worry about them. Okay, so let's just find somewhere good to dock this preview window. Let's just dump it here, I suppose is probably a good place. So this preview, the live preview, won't necessarily always update everything. Sometimes you'll want to restart it, but most of the time it's going to. So you can, just let's add a camera. Let's add a new camera. Let's choose a Cycles4D camera, and you can see this just has the Cycles4D camera tag applied. I'm going to look through that camera, and now we should be able to just move our scene, and the update will happen in real time, and then it will start to clear up. But the preview is following our moves pretty well. It's certainly usable, and for working in materials when you're setting up a new shader or something, this is plenty fast enough, and you can see already it's looking pretty clean, certainly clean enough to be able to work with. Okay, so let's actually talk about setting up a material. So unlike Cinema 4D materials where you would double click in the material manager, what we need to do is go to create, cycles. Then we have three options: background material, which goes on your sky, so that'd be for using HDRIs, that sort of thing. The light material, which, as you can imagine, is for making lights, and object material, which is pretty much for everything else. So if we drag this and just replace our materials on those two objects, you'll see that nothing else is happening straight away, and that's because we've already got default materials on our mesh already. So even though it's updating, nothing is going to change because it's the same material. So let's double click this and open it up, and let's have a look at our nodes. So let's give ourselves a bit more room. Okay, Now, output is just what it says. This is kind of taking all of the other nodes and all of their information and applying it to the mesh. So this is like the material render, is probably a good way of thinking at it. This is your final, what's going to be stuck on your mesh. Okay, so I'm actually just going to pause this because there's a slight bit of lag, which I think is due to the fact that I'm using Camtasia at the same time. So it just means that you're having to wait a second for things to update. That's not normally a problem. It's usually very, very smooth and slick. Right, so let's have a look at what we have. So we have a diffuse BSDF, and a BSDF is kind of your standard shader type. And all we have is an input for color, input for roughness, and an input for the vector, which is, kind of the direction that things are facing. So the roughness control is, if you think of this as being like a micro bump, is probably a good way of thinking of it. So it's the smoothness or coarseness of the surface at a very tiny level, not the sort of level you would use a bump map for. And if you look at this preview here, you can see it's already looking pretty rough, but if we increase this roughness, it smooths it out, the kind of the shading even more, which is what happens when you increase the roughness. Now, I would avoid using extremes, so don't use 0, don't use 1, anything in between should be fine. Now we can plug in an image or a gradient or a noise or anything into this color channel, or we can click it and choose a color ourselves. Let's go for a lovely bright pink. Actually, let's make something a little bit more realistic. I'm going to go for a very slightly blue grey color, and we're going to do a kind of a slate. Now with this selected, you can also make these same changes over here in the node attributes or the node settings. We can also look at material settings here. Now we can have bump or true or both. True is like proper displacement, so we'll turn that on, but there's something to bear in mind there. Sometimes you won't get a proper displacement on your mesh. Let's just play this for it to update, because of the subdivision types, which is where this tag comes in order, and this is the cycles object tag. And if we click on that and bring up its attributes, let's move the preview out of the way, we can go to displacement, and the default you can see is Catmull Clark. We also have none and linear, different kind of settings are going to have different effects on your bump. I personally like linear, and you can also turn on options for motion blur, and the basic is just going to be, here you go, we've got our name and the layer it's living on. Okay, so I'm going to pause that again just for speed's sake, bring this back over. Hopefully I'm not going too fast or kind of glossing over things that are important. So if I do miss anything, leave a comment and let me know. Right, so back to our material. So we have many nodes that we can play with, and we can mix them in various ways. We can do all sorts of things with them. And what I want to do is I want to actually take a second diffuse, and I'm going to bring that down. And what I want to do is I want to use this as a variation. So I'm going to increase the brightness, but tone down the saturation a touch. And you can see I now have these two. Now I could have plugged a noise in to one diffuse channel and had a chain, but instead I'm going to pair them. So I'm going to right click, and I'm going to take a shader, mix shader, and I'm going to mix the two together. Now if you drag that over a string, then you'll find that it plugs itself into the top. Now I'm going to plug this into the bottom, and our mix shader, you can see we have a FAC control, and that stands for factor, and we have a factor input, which is the same as the grey input that you'd see here, which means we can control it with factor outputs of other nodes, which we'll get to in a minute. So to just save a bit of space, because I'm using this video window, I'm going to double click the headers of these two nodes, and I'm just going to neaten things up just a little bit. I'm going to drag this back, and I'm going to right click in an empty space, and I'm going to go to texture, and I'm going to take an image texture, which is one of the most powerful single nodes that you'll find inside of Cycles. So I'm going to take the alpha, and I'm going to plug that in to the FAC, and at the moment you won't see anything happen. That's because there's nothing driving the alpha channel. So what I'm going to do is go to the node settings, and you'll see here we have texture, and when I click this you'll see all of the options that you'd have had in Cinema 4D. So all of those shaders are still available to you. So if you're used to using excuse me, the noise, then you could use that, which we'll do here. And we'll click on the noise and that will open its attributes. Let's just move this out of the way. I'll move that too. And I'm going to choose the fire noise. Might work quite nicely for this, I think, because it has those kind of plateaus. I'm going to decrease the size to about, I don't know, about 75. And I'm going to reduce the contrast just a little. But I'm going to increase the low clip like that. And if I just scroll back up, so this is our effect that we've got here. I'm also going to lengthen it out slightly in one direction, so I'm going to increase to about 130% in the X, and that just stretches it just a little bit. Now, this is controlling where these two go. So our shader 1 is going to be where all the white is, and shader 2 is going to be where all the black is. If you wanted to change that, you could always, of course, go into the noise and you could swap around these two colors, or alternatively, a quicker option is you could go to converter or color and choose an invert node. You could pop that in between the alpha and our factor input, and that will invert the colors that we have going on here. Now, I don't necessarily want to do that, so I'm going to just delete that node. So you can do that by right clicking it and choosing delete. We'll plug our alpha back in because I'm pretty happy with what we've got going on there, and I'm going to just close that down by double clicking it, but I'm going to leave it over here. Now, the sensible thing might be to put it in this stack, but that's not quite what I want to do because I might reuse this later. And this is where nodes become very powerful, because what I can do is I can take that alpha and I can plug it into the displacement input. You can see in the preview here, we're already getting some results. Now, I might want to invert that because it looks to me like it's going the wrong way. So I'm going to take a color node, I'm going to invert it, I'm going to take that output there, plug it into the factor, and plug that back into the displacement. And we should find that things go the other way around. Or I could actually take the color channel from there and invert it into the displacement. And then if I just hit play on our preview, just let that mesh update, give it a second, because this is actually restarting the whole process because we've made a bigger change. We should see we now have some nice bump going on. Now, this isn't exactly what I want, but that's okay because this is a good kind of large level bump. I want to be some smaller bumps as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to go shader texture, and I'm going to take a noise texture, and this is the kind of the built-in noise that you get with Cycles, and I'm going to take a mix. So I'll go actually we'll use an RGB mix. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the color, let's bring this in so we can actually see it. I'm going to take the color information from our first and from our second, like so, and we're just going to mix them in. Now I'm going to add some detail and reduce the scale a little bit of this noise, like so. And we should find that now, if I press play, fills in with some extra noise in these totally flat parts. So once this just updates, you should find that we get something a little bit more realistic. There we go. So now this is much more what I was looking for. I want there to be noise all over with some slightly larger areas of noise, or areas of larger noise. So that's looking pretty good. I'm happy with that. And this can all be closed down. I'm not going to worry about that anymore. So let's move it out the way just while we work. I wanted to show you how you can use one node for multiple tasks, and especially if you want to keep things lined up. So if you had a gradient with very specific knot placements, this would be a good way of doing that. Now, I have all of this diffuse information in these three nodes, but I want to do something a bit different as well. I want to have a bit of shine on my surface. And at the moment, this doesn't have a lot of shine, so let's add some to it. So I'm going to go to Shader, and I'm going to take a glossy BSDF, which, as you can imagine, gives us a glossy surface. And you can see there are a load of others here. You can have glass and hair and all sorts of things. But for now, we're going to choose glossy. We'll line that up, and I'm going to make it very slightly rough. Not only a really small amount. It doesn't have to be much. You'll find that the roughness affects the glossiness very, very quickly. Now, we also have various different kinds of glossy shader. So we have kind of 5 different options here, and I would suggest GGX multi-scatter is good for kind of general purposes. Beckman is very good for metals and kind of highly specular things. GGX is very similar to the GGX implementation in Cinema 4D, and Sharp I don't use that much, because if I want a sharp looking glossy surface, I use Beckman, and this Ashikman Shirley, if that's how you pronounce it, is also fairly sharp. It has a different fall off to the Beckman, but it is quite useful. But for this, we're going to use the GGX multi-scatter with a slight bit of roughness. Now we can colorize the reflection in here if we want to. I'm not going to for this purpose, but I do need to mix these together. So I need to take a second mix shader. So I'm going to come down to shader, add a mix shader. I'm going to plug that right in here. I'm going to put the glossy underneath, and we should find this has now turned very glossy. Now, the easiest way of using a mix shader is to either use the slider and drag it. Let's choose this. I think this is updating at the moment. So now this looks a bit like tinfoil, which isn't what we want. I want more control. So I'm going to use this small preview to start with. We can either use the slider to decrease the amount of shader 2, which is, it's not too bad, or we can have it all glossy, which is going to look like tinfoil with just a hint of that kind of slate color underneath, which looks like this. Now that's all good and well, but what if you want to have certain areas that are looking a little bit more reflective than others, or a little bit glossier than others? Now we could of course take our factor from our image there, our noise, and plug that in, which will give us areas of glossiness based on the noise. That again is useful because it means that the glossiness will line up to our noise for other areas. So if the glossiness was supposed to be the flat parts and the noisy parts were going to be kind of like bubbling rust, then that would be the perfect solution, because you could use that there. Now, what if you want to use something like Fresnel? If you're a Cinema 4D user, then you're quite likely to be used to using Fresnel shaders, and we have options for that as well. So let's choose a shader for our FAC. So we're going to right click, choose input, and there is a Fresnel built in. I prefer to use the layer weight shader, which I'm going to use for this. So I'm going to pop that just above the 2 shaders here, and I'm going to just reduce the blend amount and put the Fresnel into the FAC, which is the factor here, and maybe increase that a little bit more actually. And I'm just using the preview here to eyeball what I want to happen. Now I'm happy with that, so I'm just going to close it down just for space, and I'm also going to shut down these, so I don't really need to worry about them too much. Let's bring that down, and that mix shader can also go smaller like this. Let's do we'll preview this again. Now again, let me just reiterate, normally you can leave this preview running the whole time and it'll update as you work. The only reason I'm pausing it is because the video recording is slowing it down somewhat, and it's just making it a bit jerky for this video. So here we have the Fresnel in place, and you can see that it's working already. This is looking quite nice. I'm actually going to make the color a bit darker, so I'm going to take my diffuse BSDFs and I'm just going to reduce that down a little bit, and here you can see what it's making me weight, because my graphics card is dealing with all different things. So let's just pause that for a second. You do sometimes find that you have to wait for this updating mesh command to finish its process before you can do stuff if it's a particularly complex scene. Okay, so that's looking better. That's looking darker already, which is what I want. So I will just darken off this one as well, just for just for shits and giggles really. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to combine two materials into one, because I want to have, I did a material which was kind of like, I called it alien ore, and it had kind of veins of a different material completely running through it. And we can do that very simply. So all we need to do is to create, let's say we'll do a translucent shader, and let's make it kind of a nice bright pink. And it's going to have the same bump, so it'll look like ore. It's going to be kind of cut out the same bit of rock, but we could have, you know, different noise guiding that in as well. I need another mix shader, so let's plug that in. Let's plug this second shader into here, and we want to guide this with a new alpha. So let's choose something to actually use to drive where the placement's going to be, and I'm going to go for, let's use a texture, image texture. I'm just going to shut that down for room and plug the alpha into the factor input, and I'm going to choose, oh, I don't want an image, I want to choose let's go for a surface tile, which is the standard Cinema 4D tile. Move this out of the way a bit, and let's click on the title there for the tile and open up its attributes, and we'll go for a spiral. Now at the moment this is using, you know, black and red and grey. I don't want that. I want to have one entirely black and one, oops, not that one, and I want to turn that grey or white, and this will give me my alpha. And there's a very slight blur where the beveling is happening. We've got the ground width of 5% and a bevel width of 30, and that bevel of 30% is just giving us a very slight softening of the edge, which is actually a good thing for this. Okay, so I'm happy with that. This is all plugged in, and we should now find that if I restart this, we get a really lovely translucency happening in a spiral pattern. So we're getting that kind of vein. Now obviously you could use something different from a spiral. You can do all sorts of crazy effects with it, but this is a really good way of mixing two materials, and you'll see that we'll have some lovely kind of light passing through this translucent material, and it sits really nicely with the rock. And I think this is probably a good place to stop for this introductory video. Hopefully that showed you how you can mix materials and shaders in various different ways, using alphas and shaders and noise and all sorts of things. Obviously you could use a gradient, so you could have this fading into a different material. I've done a few like that. I don't know if you follow me on Instagram, then you'll have seen that I posted quite a lot of the materials as I was making them. Now, one other thing to think of is that there is no glossiness applied to this translucent material. So if we wanted to apply that, we would do exactly the same again. We would take another mix, so let's take another shader, mix shader, pop it in here, and again, I don't need to worry about having a second glossiness. If I want to have the same kind of glossy look that I've got on the rock, I can take that glossy and I can plug it straight into here as well, once Cycles catches up and lets me. So it's just updating the mesh because I added something. So let's take that and plug it in there, and I don't want it too glossy, so I'm going to use the slider to take it back towards shader 1, which is our translucent. Now you can see I've probably done this in the wrong order. I want that one to be the final mix shader. I want the glossy to come in beforehand. So let's move that round, plug it in there. There we go. Now the glossiness covers both of those shaders and we should be good to go. I'll press play and this should update and everything should be glossy all over, with the translucency underneath, which I think probably makes for a better looking material. So that's been a quick introduction into how you can use Cycles in various different ways. Now we'll look at some of the more complex uses and various different materials later on. If there are any materials you'd like me to show you how to build, then let me know. and I'll cover them all in future videos. So I've been Rob, thanks very much. I hope this has been of some use.